The 1,283-unit Harbor Point is the nation's first federal housing project to become a private, mixed-income housing. It is a national model for redeveloping public housing. Harbor Point was once Columbia Point, a 1,500-unit public housing project where only 350 units were occupied. The rest were boarded up and condemned. The developers Corcoran, Mullins, and Jennison formed a partnership with the resident council to redevelop the property. The construction started in 1987, and the construction was completed in 1990.
Well, Columbia Point was one of the worst public housing developments in the country. When I became receiver, appointed by Judge Paul Garrity to run the Housing Authority under his jurisdiction, because he'd taken it away from the city, Columbia Point was down to about 800 families. No, excuse me, less than that, down to about 400 families. Out of, as I remember, something like 12 or 1,800 units. It was overwhelmingly vacant. My own conclusion was we had many developments around the city. Boston had the second largest per capita public housing program in the country after Newark, third largest in absolute terms after New York City and Chicago. So we had dozens of projects around the city. Why Columbia Point being totally transformed into a mixed-income development? My belief was that Columbia Point's isolation made it impossible for it to operate as an effective community. That it was so isolated from any kind of, there was no surrounding neighborhood context. It was stuck out on a point by itself. And that made it impossible for a very low-income community to survive. There were no services, in fact, almost none. There was the Columbia Point Health Center, that was it. No stores, no neighborhood life, no nothing. And my conclusion was that public housing worked when it was in the context of a neighborhood and didn't when it was isolated. And so the extreme isolation of Columbia Point guaranteed its continued crisis, that it would be in continued crisis if we kept it operating as very low-income public housing. In addition, the city was had already declared a desire to turn it into mixed-income housing. And so they'd been developing plans for it as mixed-income housing for some time. So I decided to go along with that because I agreed with the judgment that it was not viable in the long term as purely very low-income housing. That it needed to develop into something more like a real neighborhood. It was almost entirely vacated. It was over 2/3 vacant. In fact, I think dramatically more than 2/3 vacant. High-rise buildings, which for family housing are very difficult. Multiple large families off a single corridor with tiny little elevators that broke down regularly. It was a scary place to live. It was probably viewed as the most dangerous public housing development in the city. And the people who lived there were often living pretty fearfully. It was stuck off on Columbia Point, separated from the rest of the city. In some ways a beautiful location, looking out over Boston Harbor and the water. But given its isolation and the fearfulness, that there wasn't much about it that was appealing. That it had the potential to be a great location, sure, but it wasn't that. With the multiple high-rise buildings, the dark and dank and scary elevators, the problems of keeping safety and security in 10 or 12 or 13-story buildings with multiple kids was really a problem. So it was in pretty terrible shape. The Harbor Point design was to convert Columbia Point to a mixed-income community. The example that Corcoran, Mullins, and Jennison had developed, they're ultimately the developers of Columbia Point. They had done converted a public housing development in Lynn, Massachusetts into something they called Kings Lynn, in which they converted low-income housing into a mix of low, moderate, and market rate housing. And they were proposing, and others were agreeing, that it should be some kind of a mixed-income development that would create much more of a neighborhood. The 5 years I was there, we didn't start construction. Construction didn't start actually until shortly after I left, because we had to get commitments from the federal government. In the meantime, the plan changed. Initially, the plan was for low income, moderate income, and market rate folks. The Reagan administration came into office shortly after I arrived at the Boston Housing Authority and initially declared they were going to abolish the public housing program. So they were vehemently opposed to subsidies for any kind of low-income housing, and the whole moderate income piece then fell out. There was the money for moderate income subsidies for moderate income residents were abolished. So by the time the place started construction, it became just very low income and market rate. One of the battles I had was with Joe Corcoran, the head of Corcoran Mullins and Jennison. Joe had a movie that he had made about Kings Lynn in Lynn, Massachusetts. And the movie was all about how the private sector can solve problems that the stupid public sector can't solve. And I said to Joe, if we're going to select you, Joe, I want a commitment from you that you will never again talk about this as a private solution. He called the movie Private Solutions to Public Problems. I said, Joe, you're receiving more subsidy than I ever receive as heading up the Boston Housing Authority. You're getting more help from the public than any public housing authority ever gets. It's not a private solution. If you want to talk about it as a public-private partnership, that's fine. But to call it a private solution to a public problem is complete rot. And I want a commitment from you that you will never use Harbor Point for that purpose. My contribution was, I guess, to agree to do it. I actually think my contribution was to ensure a significant number of low-income units because I think the city's intention was to keep reducing the amount of low income and make it as much market as possible. I called their bluff on what they were doing and I think forced the resolution of the issue. To some extent, I'd like to think, if too much time had gone by, I don't know if it would have been possible to build Harbor Point because the subsidies kept diminishing and diminishing. But most of all, I just, from my view, what I did was to really call the bluff of the city, force their hand, and get them to go ahead and do what they've been talking about for a long time. And by that process, ensure that there was a reasonable